Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy, episode 92. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. And if you've been listening to me for a while, you know that one thing I've been working on is helping organizations and companies to create podcasts that are just as hip and cool and wonderful as indie podcasts with that oh so smooth professional polish. I mean, as a podcaster, you know it's one thing to successfully create a podcast that informs, engages, and inspires. And what you may or may not know is it is quite another to do all of that while maintaining the voice of an organization. How exactly do you do that? Well, today I'm talking with the team behind Destination Santa Fe Opera, a show that I produce for the Santa Fe Opera that makes this whole package of organizational podcasting goodness sound so easy. Today's guests are Emily Doyle Moore, Director of Media and Public Relations at the Santa Fe Opera and executive producer of the show, Dune Alford, former media and PR associate and DSFO producer, and Jane Trembley, former house manager at the Santa Fe Opera and the current host of Destination Santa Fe Opera. And you are going to hear so much insight about what works, what's challenging, and how decisions get made. Everything from how did Jane end up becoming the host to how exactly do you measure intangible return on investment from your podcast? Because let me make this clear, just getting more downloads and listeners to your show isn't always the most compelling marker of true podcasting success. Of course, you will find links for Destination Santa Fe Opera and any other resources we mention in the show notes for this episode at thecreativeimposter.com/092 and linked up conveniently in the show notes for you in your episode description in your podcast listening app. Now, before I let the DSFO team take it away, I do have two quick things I wanted to mention, totally unrelated. I mean, well, they're about podcasting, but you know. Number one, I'm trying something new, and that is a private podcast feed for anyone who joins me on the email list for Podcast Envy. This is a 5-episode exclusive podcast called 5 Questions You Haven't Asked About Your Podcast. And you may be thinking, that sounds familiar. If you already are on the Podcast Envy mailing list, you may have received an email sequence also titled 5 Questions You Haven't Asked About Your Podcast. And it's been a while since I've updated those questions, and I have kind of a different take on the content I already created. And you've never heard those 5 questions come out of my mouth in your very own podcast listening app before. And that's what the private podcast feed is all about. So how can you get this exclusive 5-episode bonus feed designed to help you either launch a brand new show of significance or take a look at your existing show and see where you can give it a refresh in 2022? Well, if you are already on the Podcast Envy email list, you will receive an email automatically once it's ready, inviting you to add the show to your favorite podcast player. If you haven't subscribed to my email list or you're not sure, no worries. Pop on over to thecreativeimposter.com/5 questions. That's thecreativeimposter.com/5 questions. Drop your best email and you will get it too. Also, another thing I am super, super, super excited about is a brand new podcast from the Creative Imposter Studios. Oh, as if I don't already have enough podcasts to create. However, this one is super special. It is called Improve with Auntie, and it is a creative roundtable for aunties like us to share our brilliant ideas, wise advice, and a whole lot of laughs along the way. This limited 6-episode season is coming to a podcast app near you in the month of December 2021. And so if you are an auntie, regardless of whether you call yourself aunt, auntie, titi, tia, whatever the title, you know who you are. We would love to have you be part of our listening community. You can find out more and get the links to follow the show in your favorite podcast app at Improve with Auntie. That's with an IE. .com, linked of course for you in the show notes. All right, enough with the announcements. I am so excited about all of these developments for 2022. You have no idea. Oh, and just one more thing. A shout out to our brand new editing apprentice at the Creative Imposter Studios, Kathy Robinson, for editing this episode. All right, now with no further ado, entertaining, community building, informing, there is nothing that a well-crafted organizational podcast can't do, and you're about to find out how with Emily Doyle Moore, Dune Alford, and Jane Trembley of Destination Santa Fe Opera. Emily Doyle Moore, Jane Trembley, and Dune Alford, thank you so much for joining me on Podcast Envy.
Woo!
Thanks. Wow, like so exciting. Thanks for having us.
Jane, what does it feel like to be a podcast guest instead of a podcast host in this moment?
It's very weird. I feel like I'm just here smiling instead of being nervous about, okay, I got to keep this moving.
Nice. So we are here talking about Destination Santa Fe Opera, which this season was a new podcast, but not a new podcast. Right off the tops of your heads at the end of this first season of this version of the show that we're all working on. High level gut reaction feeling. How are you feeling about the season overall? Let's start with Emily.
I feel really excited about it. We made such progress, as you said, from season 1, if you call it season 1 to season 2. And that was a real goal and objective for us. And I feel thrilled that we will have completed 12 episodes during a really historic season for the opera. So we have this document to match, which I'm just thrilled about.
And when you say historic season, say more about what you mean by that.
Yeah, I mean, unless you've been living under a rock, you probably know the world basically came to a halt with COVID, and our 2020 season, well, along with so many others, had to be canceled. So this past season, our 2021 season, we were able to present. It was a reopening season for us. We were one of the first opera companies in the world to be able to return to performances in their own venue. So we produced a podcast alongside those activities, which were historic in nature. And when I say it's a document of that time, it very much is a time capsule of what was happening, what was on our minds, and, art finds a way. Destination Santa Fe Opera reflects that, I think.
And not only historic moment, but also I would say probably very emotional as well.
Very emotional. And you can hear that in a lot of the episodes, these conversations with singers who hadn't sung and were anticipating doing that for the first time in 10 months or 18 months. And the meaning that so many of us find in producing art on that stage.
Yeah. Dune, how are you feeling about the season?
Wow. Good, mostly. I think that Emily put it really beautifully, but probably left out the parts where it was also a challenge. She's laughing. So I would say that I'm also really, really proud of what we did. I'm really, really happy to have Jane and think that she did an incredible job. And I know we always talked about how I felt like she was doing better every single episode, felt even more and more comfortable in the role, and just a really great person to shepherd you through those stories.
Okay, it is one thing to be the host of your own podcast or represent your own brand on a show, but to become the voice of the organization you work for, that is quite another thing altogether.
It definitely was a lot to take on because, like Emily said, it was a historic season for us. So I think once the season really started popping off was when we started realizing the weight of balancing all of those different things. So yeah, that's kind of my most recent thought about it because of it has been a whirlwind.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy when you think about it. When we're having a conversation, when we say season, we could mean opera season or we could mean podcast season.
Right.
And they are two different things that overlap. So season upon season, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Quick aside here about seasons. The Santa Fe Opera is a festival opera, meaning that their entire opera season on the main stage runs throughout the summer months, primarily July and August. It is a whole lot of activity packed into a very short period of time that requires the whole year to prepare and recover from. The podcast season is actually a little bit longer and starts prior to the opera season to help build up momentum and anticipation for the main stage operas, and then overlaps with the opening of the operas. You're going to hear a little bit more about what the schedule and the energy of that opera season feels like in a bit. Jane, thoughts about the season?
I mean, it was so exciting and I learned so much. I mean, thinking back to the very first interview, I was so incredibly nervous. And then by the time I was talking to Angel Blue, I was just really comfortable. And I have to thank Dune and Emily for that, for just really coaching me and helping me with the questions and, you know, the little bit of rehearsal we did. But what really sticks out to me about the podcast as a whole is just that people that I met, it really enhanced their opera that they went to see. And I felt really great about that because they were able to see the perspective of the opera from one of the singers, which you really don't get very often. And I think that was really special to give that to people, and as well as interviewing people who you don't see on stage who make things happen. So I was really grateful to be able to have those conversations with them and learn a lot myself.
So you actually got feedback from listeners about the show.
Yeah, I did.
Ah, the holy grail for podcasters, real, live, audience feedback. Did people approach you because they knew who you were, or did you seek out that feedback?
It depends. Like, there were different aspects. Some of it was just like my family who went to see an opera, and of course they listen. A few of my ushers at the opera were listening to the podcast, so they would talk to me about, you know, the most recent episode that they heard, and they would tell me, you know, oh my gosh, it was so great to hear from Chelsea, like in production. I was at a restaurant and I said thank you to a busser, and he went, I know your voice. And I was like, what? And he was like, are you the opera host of that podcast? And I was like, what? I am, yes. And so I was able to talk with him, and he was like, yeah, I'm really getting into opera. It's like a new thing because I'm from here and I learned that we have an opera house. And then I found the podcast, and it's been so helpful. So I did have different times when I would get some feedback, and it was really wild because, you know, it's a podcast. It feels so personal. And then it's people come up to you in real life and you're like, oh, you listened to my conversation.
Yeah. It's pretty incredible too, to be recognized for your voice, especially when you also are a singer.
Yeah, it was very bizarre.
So we should maybe back up a second and talk a little bit about what each of your roles are with the opera and also with the podcast specifically, Emily.
I am the Director of Media and Public Relations for the Santa Fe Opera. My role with the podcast was really as a collaborator with Dune and with Jane on setting everything about it. We got to plan and to dream and set our strategy and make it up as we went, as it were. We knew we wanted to do more episodes. As you referenced, we had the previous iteration of this podcast was called Beyond the Opera. It was a very limited 5-episode capsule, and we knew we wanted to tell a lot more stories, engage with a lot more people, really bring in more of a youthful element, really bring in more of this is about opera, but it's conversations that could be about any craft. And it's meant to be niche, and it's meant to be talking about shop, but also very accessible and relatable for maybe somebody who is like Jane's busser she met, who's like, I'm just getting into opera. And this is just a really, really easy, fun way to get in. It's an open door.
Yeah, I think that's super important because when you were talking with me early on about the direction that you wanted to take this season, that was very clear. You know, anytime that I'm working on strategy and a production angle for an organization, I always go out and try to find as many other podcasts that I can find in that industry or in that niche just to kind of see what's out there. And opera has always mystified me a little bit how few podcasts there actually are in opera. I always feel like it should be something that there's a lot more of them. There are some people doing good quality work and there are some people doing some interesting things, but they all kind of have a similar vibe. In some cases, and I think this is a thing with opera in general, in some cases, it does sort of feel like if you're not already in the know or if you're not already in the inner circle, that it kind of doesn't feel relevant or you kind of don't really know what they're talking about. And it doesn't add to the accessibility of the art form. It just kind of feels like it's in its own little bubble. And so that felt like a very clear intention.
Yeah, to cast the net wider and bring more audiences in, or potential audiences, as it were. That was really, really fundamental to our strategy. So that was my role in the podcast, and we dreamed up everything from a new name, Destination Santa Fe Opera, to new cover art that Dune executed, and a new host.
Okay, this is key strategy right here. Are you paying attention? Purpose plus audience equals informed choices about your title, your host, your music, your cover art, your format, your content. all of those choices will become easier and more aligned when you get clear on your purpose and your audience from the beginning. Dune, what was your role on the podcast? And maybe you could also tell us a little bit about what coming up with the new name was like from your perspective.
Oh, yeah. That was a hard one. Oh, man. Well, yeah. So I work under Emily, and it was something that came up. Well, kind of insider knowledge. We really utilized the podcast the first season when it was called something else for the shuttles. And with COVID, it really kind of opened up this new possibility of, we weren't able to offer shuttles this year in the same capacity that we would normally, just for safety.
And shuttles, for those who
thanks.
have never been to the Santa Fe Opera, like, what are you talking about?
Yes, yeah. So we used to shepherd people from different areas in Santa Fe up to the Santa Fe Opera. If you don't know, the Santa Fe Opera, you think, okay, it's an opera company, it's a big theater, it's probably in the middle of downtown. No, that is incorrect. It is basically exactly what the podcast is, a destination. It is out of town, so it's a trek to go up to the opera.
And so Beyond the Opera, the predecessor to Destination Santa Fe Opera, was conceived as a way for patrons who were already on their way to the opera via this shuttle bus from Santa Fe or Albuquerque to get some insider insight about the show that they already had tickets for, that they were already on their way to see. We also released it as a public podcast, but now with those shuttles taken off the table, it gave us the freedom and flexibility to think a little more expansively about how we could serve a wider audience beyond those who already had tickets to those who either A, hadn't made the choice yet, but could, or B, weren't going to come to the opera this season, but could still feel included and still learn something and have an experience with the Santa Fe Opera from home.
Anyway, with that shift, we had the opportunity to kind of envision something new. And Emily kind of gave me this gift to be able to pitch an idea. And I was really concerned about bringing in a younger audience and kind of had this vision of exactly what you said of there's opera podcasts, but they kind of all serve the same purpose, explaining what the opera is that's going to be on stage, which was kind of what we had been doing before too. And that's a very valuable purpose as well. But I kind of, from experience, totally side note, Jane and I had started a podcast together in the pandemic.
Are you still doing that podcast?
Yes, actually, we just recorded our first back episode last night together because we took a massive break because of the season. Jane was working 2 jobs, so 3 if you count this one. So definitely we took a break. But yeah, we're back at it.
So we will have to link to your show in the show notes for this episode as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's called Once Upon a Workday. Anyway, with that background, I kind of was aware of the niche that you have to be in a podcast. What's interesting about this podcast, it really separates yourself from other podcasts. And I kind of thought maybe a youth view.
Listen, I don't know who coined this phrase, but you hear it all the time. The riches are in the niches, or the riches are in the niches. I don't know, but you know what I mean.
And then really funny, of course, I am friends with Jane. We used to work together in front of house at the Santa Fe Opera. We had this podcast together and I pitched the idea, but I didn't want to be like, Jane would be a great host because that just felt like too, all of the same world. And then Emily was the one who was like, what about Jane as the host? And I was like, well, I wasn't going to say that, but that seems like a great idea. And it turned out to be a really good direction. I didn't even talk about the name. The name was probably the hardest part of the whole process that we went back and forth on a million times. The cover was pretty easy, I think. As I remember, we were all really on board with the concept and kind of worked collaboratively to make it its dream. But the name, man, it really stuck us for a long time because we didn't want to feel like a travel magazine or anything. We wanted it to be specifically Santa Fe Opera. So, and then I guess in the way of how I was just talking about, Santa Fe Opera is a destination. So that kind of is how we landed on this.
Emily, what sparked the idea that Jane might be the ideal host for our season?
Yeah, so in an ideal world, it would have been Jane and Dune together because, as mentioned, they have a podcast together and they have a long friendship and they are just a really great duo together. I just knew Dune was going to be too busy.
Oh, yeah.
And I know
there's
actually
no way.
Jane was too busy as well, but she was willing. So we went with it. I enjoyed listening to their other podcasts and I think that they play well off each other and they have a really conversational, casual vibe. And that was more in line with what we were looking to do with just being, again, more accessible, more open, more friendly, more organic, if you will. And I knew Jane, just to add to that, she has this historical knowledge of the Santa Fe Opera, having served as house manager this past season and having an affinity with the company, a relationship with the company since high school. So she has long knowledge of the organization, of what we do, our craft, and as a singer as well. She's able to talk that end of shop. So it's just so many things aligned. I mean, Dune's being modest, but it's like she led me all the way to the water and it was impossible for me not to drink from it. Because, we had talked about like maybe a really youthful person, like somebody who's 13 or 14 and just getting started. Yeah.
Still maybe an idea if we want to.
Totally. That's just such a special person. And I didn't know that person, to be honest, but Jane really bridges the gap beautifully.
And I think for an organization or a company, choosing your host is one of the most important choices that you need to make and one of the most challenging in some cases. People think, well, obviously we'll have the CEO of the company be the host, or obviously we'll have the director of PR and marketing be the host. Sometimes people think that's an obvious answer of who that is, but finding those exact characteristics and traits with Jane, it's like that balance between the knowledge and the history and the expertise, but also having this curiosity to learn more where she knows so much already. You can still share something with Jane that she doesn't already know.
Curiosity. And that's actually, I'm really glad you brought that up because that was part of our strategy. I had several conversations with our general director and he's more accustomed to us presenting or giving a platform to somebody with a real authority, a scholar, if you will. All of our pre-show lectures are in that vein. So I really tried to sway all parties towards somebody who, yes, has knowledge, but we're learning with that person. And it's not from a place of authority and teaching and imparting. It's that we're all on that journey together. Yeah. And that's so important.
I'm so glad that was the direction we were able to go on.
And so, Jane, for you coming in, also, I think being a podcast host of a show that you're creating that is representing your own brand or your own business or your own interests or your own hobbies is one thing. And that in and of itself is already a big enough challenge. But then being a host on behalf of the organization that you work for, what were some of the unique challenges, if you can say that with Emily and Dune listening in? What were some of the unique challenges for you in figuring out how to navigate that particular role?
Well, actually, it's funny because that part to me was really easy because the opera was my first job and it was one of my only jobs for a really long time. There's just this comfort that comes with the Santa Fe Opera, and everybody at the Santa Fe Opera is so loving. I didn't really ever have like a fear of I have to be so careful. I just really had the pressure on myself to represent the company well. And I had to remind myself, well, they have hired me to come here for 7 or 8 seasons, so they like me. And I really had to just have that confidence in myself. But when it came to just really representing the opera well, I also just was honest with myself and I would ask Dune and Emily questions, which was really helpful just to tell myself, I don't have all the answers. I need to lean on the PR and media department because they have all the answers.
Nobody can see the video, but right now, as soon as Jane said they have all the answers, Emily was cracking up.
To me, it feels like that.
Of course we have all the answers.
And that's what we're, of course, assigned to project. Yeah. But anyone who's actually in the media and PR world knows.
But they really did make me feel like they could always answer my questions. And I was really grateful that I could lean on them for that. And then our guests were so lovely and they loved the Santa Fe Opera too so much that it really just made all of that so easy.
And it's that special time of the episode where you get to hear about our featured podcast angel. Podcast angels are those product services companies that support you, the podcaster, and me, the bridge between you and them, for a win-win-win match made in podcasting heaven. I am over the moon to tell you about this brand new podcast angel, Hello Audio. Remember back in the intro when I mentioned a private podcast feed, a 5-episode exclusive that would be yours when you join my email list? Well, that is being powered by Hello Audio, a private podcasting platform that has the potential to completely transform the way that you think about and use podcasting as a medium to grow your community, expand your business, service your clients and customers and members and followers. It's incredible. I already have about 100 different ideas for how I'm going to use Hello Audio's service in the year 2022. And I'm sure you'll be hearing all about it. So if you are curious about this whole private podcasting thing, or if you already know this is 100% something that I have to check out, go to thecreativeimposter.com/hello audio, linked of course for you in the show notes for this episode, for your 7-day free trial of their powerhouse level membership. That's the one I got, naturally. They've got demos, tutorials, and more. And when you subscribe to my private audio feed, 5 questions you haven't asked about your podcast, you'll get a taste of just what a beautiful user experience it is. Once again, that link is thecreativeimposter.com/hello audio. And when you sign up with them, they'll send me a little thank you for playing matchmaker. Once again, that's thecreativeimposter.com/hello audio. And don't forget to get 5 questions you haven't asked about your podcast at thecreativeimposter.com/5 questions. I know, I say all the time, don't get distracted by sparkly, shiny objects in podcasting, but this shiny object is so dazzling, I can't help but share it with you. So speaking of guests and loving on the Santa Fe Opera, highlights from the season. Does anybody have either a favorite episode listening back after the fact or a favorite moment during recording? I mean, I know Emily wasn't really there for most of the recording, so hers would have to be like a pre or post production moment, but any highlights from this season? I know it's hard to pick and you don't want to leave anybody out, but does anything stand out when I say that?
One thing for me that stands out is, this was really far into recording the podcast, and it was with Angel Blue, and she's like so famous. She's such a popular opera singer right now. And I was really happy that we interviewed her so late on because I had kind of figured out how to do it and I wasn't as nervous, but I was pretty nervous. But she made it so easy to talk to. And then there's a moment in the episode where I bring up an opinion and she disagrees very much with it. And it was awesome. I was so excited to have her get so passionate about something. We could have gone on and on about it, and that was really amazing. And I feel like that shows what the podcast does, and that it can just be a conversation that needs to be had. It doesn't have to be something that we present perfectly on a platter that has the answer. It's like, well, this is just a conversation. And so that was really fun.
Yeah, I think sometimes people fall into the trap of thinking that you should bring on guests that have the same perspective and point of view as you, and you should all like have a lovely conversation about all the things that you agree upon and have the same thoughts upon. And sometimes the most interesting conversations do come up when there is differing opinions, if you can then use that to sort of explore the topic or the concept a little bit more. So it's interesting that you bring that up. And it's more interesting for the listeners too. It just like gives them something to like dig into and reflect on as well.
I think my favorite thing about the podcast that I was not expecting at all was that a lot of times Jane and I were like the first friends that some of these people made.
Meaning when they got into town for the opera, because that's something I think a lot of people outside of opera may not realize, is that many of the artists, performers, technicians, even, it actually is a work destination for them as well. Like they are coming from out of town to be a part of the opera season. Yeah, so the Santa Fe Opera is traditionally around 70 people full-time, and then it grows from that to 700 approximately as seasonal staff. So almost everybody that's working at the opera is from all over the world. And I mean, it was really interesting being able to interview people that were in Europe. We did a few of those interviews where it was our morning and someone's evening, and it was really interesting and fun. And then we would have full connections with, I know Vanessa Vasquez, she was extremely sweet to us. Avery Amaro was like
making plans to hang out with us. And then when they came into town, it really felt like we had already established these connections and friends. Because you're right, Jane, like podcasting is really intimate. It's a conversation and you don't think about people listening to it when you're doing it. So I wasn't even talking. I was just in the room, you know? So I think that's not a specific moment, but that was just my favorite thing about doing the podcast that I was not expecting.
It's sort of like an unexpected, whenever we're talking with organizations, we always have to talk about what's the return on investment for the podcast. And it's sometimes hard to pin down because from what I have seen and experienced is that most of the time, it's not necessarily like there isn't a number that you can equate to what the return on investment is. It's not like, oh, we put out this many episodes, we spent this amount of money on it, and we got this many new opera subscribers. Like there's never any way that you can measure that. That's not a thing that's going to happen. You can't even, you can say we got this many downloads or this many listeners, but then what does that actually mean?
Yeah.
It's not really a compelling story that you can bring back to the general director or bring back to the board or something like that. But then when you look at this community building aspect, even amongst the participants and the guests who are coming in and being part of the show as well, that's something that is part of that narrative that is kind of like an intangible but super important benefit. I'm wondering, Emily, I want to hear about your favorite moments too, but I also want to hear about how else you justify the existence of this show to the people that you need to make the argument
That was
for.
Emily's job, 100%. She had to do all that.
Those are all really good questions. Okay, keep me on track. I'll start with the latter first. I love that you brought up the question of intangibles because I am the director of media and PR, and some of that is intangibles because we have a marketing department that makes sense of a lot of our data and is tracking our investments as they relate to marketing and ticket sales. And one could even make the argument about future relationships with the company, whether that's a donor or production underwriter, on and on and on. Anyway, all of that is to say with the podcast, yes, there are those things like downloads or number of continents reached, which for us is 6 out of 7. Thank you very much. But really, it's those intangibles, those conversations, that community building that is really at the heart. And I think it's the success of the podcast, and we hope to continue on and grow and give it some time to really just reach people where they're at and find them. I would also say it's not necessarily a tangible that I can bring to the general director, but for me in my role, it was extremely helpful being able to share interviews with artists and other creatives with members of the press before they went and had those interviews themselves. So they were that much more prepared in their own interviews and feature pieces because of the podcast. It set the stage for them, so to speak.
This is like a very technical note. Would you just send them the audio or did you use the transcripts at all or anything?
I would usually send them that episode link. Really, many members of press were very happy to have that as an additional resource.
I never thought of that.
Because it bypasses the need for a pre-production interview. Yeah. It's a fast track to getting to know that artist.
Wow.
In this piece, in this company this summer.
If you've never worked in PR, you may not realize the magnitude of how great a benefit this is. But that's what I mean. The cool thing about using podcasts in an organization or in a business or in a brand is that there are so many unique use case scenarios that we get to uncover together.
And then the first part of your question was about highlights in terms of guests. I was just really proud that, Dune and I discussed quite carefully who we wanted to invite, and we wanted to make sure we had really good representation of people who you see and hear on stage who are very visible, and those who are hard at work behind the scenes, and other key players, administrators, our general director, our audience services director, our production director. And so a bit like our season, we're known for having this sort of balanced season of the old and the new. We have a balanced season in our podcast of people who represent the Santa Fe Opera and the work that we do. And I was really, really proud of that. And we threw Jane right into the deep end. Her first interview was with our general director, and he very much values preparation. He's a relatively formal gentleman. And he really, really loved it. He was so happy and the interview went so well. He's given a lot of interviews and this was one of the best he'd given. And just because Jane helped him to feel so comfortable and it was so friendly and it was just allowed to flow. And we sent him a cut of the episode before it went live and he had no edits. Yeah. And that's just not something we normally encounter. There's always edits, of course. So that was really exciting. And I was just very tickled with that sort of set the bar for how we came out swinging out the gate.
Yeah. This is another intangible and oh so valuable benefit of having an organizational podcast, which is that there is something about the intimate, genuine, authentic quality of a conversation with someone who is in leadership at your organization, that it allows the people working inside of the organization to get to know that leader in a totally different, more relatable way, when typically in the day-to-day, that person may be at arm's length or even further. Okay, you said that you have some ideas for next season, and I know that we'll be talking off microphone a little bit more about those things, but is there anything that you're willing to share with Podcast Envy listeners that is like a little sneak peek of what you might like to try or implement for the coming season?
That's a good question. I'm, walking the line of wanting to project confidence and excitement, but not overcommit ourselves.
Yeah, I think just to keep on going on a similar track that we're on and just being really creative with who we bring on as guests, especially because the Santa Fe Opera is there's so much that happens. It's wild that we can really be a little bit more creative and keep in mind that we want the younger audience and we want to teach them something and craft our questions in that way where they can really know, well, wow, I didn't even know I could go into box office. And that sounds like so much fun. How do I do that? Things like that. We want to inspire people because you don't just have to be on the stage. And I think that's something that the podcast really outlines. And I think we can continue doing that.
This is so aligned with Destination Santa Fe Opera as a purpose-driven podcast. One thing that the organization does really well is to facilitate top-notch apprentice programs to develop the opera artists and tech professionals of the future in the present. You can hear more about the apprentice programs in episodes such as Pre-Professional Training Virtual Lessons and the Young Voices of the Santa Fe Opera with Kathleen Clausen and John Daughtry from May 21st, 2021, audition videos, cover roles, and fight scenes with apprentice singers Teresa Perota and Alan Michael Jones from August 13 of 2021, and adventures on stage and behind the scenes with technical apprentices Larry Ortiz and Caitlin Sandoval from August 20th. All of those will be linked for you in the show notes. I totally have had that thought when listening to the interviews in the show is like, this is a great careers in opera kind of resource for people who are like up and coming or thinking about, what they want to do with the rest of their lives.
Yes.
The last kind of thing that I want to ask is advice for another organization, be it an opera company, an arts organization, a nonprofit in general, anyone who's thinking about implementing this into their PR media strategy, their community outreach strategy, anything like that. What advice would you have for another organization?
I have a thought.
Yes.
Well, actually, to be perfectly honest, Jane and I were recording our podcast last night and we went through some of your questions and discussed it. But something that came up when we were talking about it is I was thinking, really, a podcast is a super unique way to communicate things for a company. It's really like unlike anything else that you can get. You have blog posts, you have social media, you have, of course, press releases and lecture series, all of these different tools that you can use to connect with an audience. And podcasting, I think, has been the only one where you can make mistakes and kind of explore a idea without tying yourself into it 100%. And I think that's what's important about it is it's a conversation. So you can have somebody on, like Jane said, who disagrees with you and have that still be a super valuable tool that people can listen to and have a new perspective on something like opera. And I think that especially Well, I mean, in a lot of organizations, when you're really attached to the institutional voice, it's hard to release yourself to have those more vulnerable conversations, and especially in today's time. Those are the conversations that we want to have, but we don't want to commit to anything before feeling like it's really absolutely where we stand 100%. And I think podcasting is that opportunity to have those conversations and explore those realms. And yeah, absolutely. I think that every company should have a podcast.
One more time for the people in the back or the people doing dishes. Turn the water off and listen to this one once more.
I mean, in a lot of organizations, when you're really attached to the institutional voice, it's hard to release yourself to have those more vulnerable conversations, and especially in today's time. Those are the conversations that we want to have. And I think podcasting is that opportunity to have those conversations.
Yeah, and maybe just to start and not be too precious about it, a little bit like what Dune is getting at, and that it's an organic conversation and it's an evolution, hopefully between multiple parties in that conversation. And that's what makes it so interesting. And with the software that we now have available to us, this democratization of podcasting software, it's much more doable than it had been, 5 years ago, where you needed to book a studio and really have people physically in the same space in order to make this happen. This is actually kind of the perfect tool for this time.
I would just say have fun with it, because it really was so much fun. And I would always remind myself just to have a good time chatting with the amazing person I was about to interview. And I think to really utilize it as a tool for the people, for your patrons who really want more. They just really want to dive in, and that's where you can give them what they want, because, you can only put out so much social media content. It's really hard, especially when there's video involved. Mm-hmm. That's so difficult. But the people who really want more from the company, you can do a podcast and give them so much. Yeah, I just think have fun and explore things.
Any closing thoughts or anything that you did not get a chance to share or say that's coming to your mind right now for our Podcast Envy listeners?
I think I just would like to thank you, because you're actually the magic glue in all of this. As our producer, and giving us such a great sound and new sounds every week or with every episode. And we're so grateful to you, because you have just been such a fantastic collaborator and really a joy to work with, and have helped us sort of dream those bigger dreams and go for it. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah, something we didn't even get a chance to talk about was like sound design and music, which I feel was so new for this season.
It felt like listening to this podcast was like listening to the best produced podcast I have in my queue. And I was like, oh, this is our podcast.
Yeah,
so
you're
cool.
A magician. You really are, in making the right musical choices and intuitively finding the core of the conversation that you pull out for the audiograms, and like what the heart is, what really is being discussed. And yeah, as Dune said, the musical selections are always spot on, always so thoughtful, and it all just comes together as this fantastic whole, a lot like the shows on our stage. Mm-hmm.
Okay, I didn't leave in all that praise to brag about myself and my team, but rather to show you what it can be like to work with a producer who really gets both podcasting and you as an organization, who can fully grasp what it is you're trying to communicate and what you want to do with your show. It goes way beyond cleaning up the dialogue in the edit and posting your show to a hosting platform online. There's so much more collaboration that can happen behind the scenes to add value to that incredible audio content that you are already working so hard to create. Yeah, I think it's a lot easier as a producer when the vision for the show is very clear and is very cohesive. And I know, you very clearly stated the values, the purpose of the show, the feel of the show that you want. When all of that is clear and everyone's on the same page, it makes it so much easier to turn around the work that you're expecting.
It was just so wonderful. And I'm so grateful for the whole opportunity. And yeah, if you're thinking of starting a podcast, just do it, because it's really fun.
Yeah.
And we'll see you for season 2.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as lemon cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz. And hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.